one of our favorite segments to be watched each and every week by those of you watching us at home and listening to us on the radio, is our weekly business and economics segment with Dr. Michael Greiner, an associate professor of management in Oakland University School of Business Administration, who joins us once again today on the Megacast. Dr. Greiner, thanks for being with us.
It's great to be here, Tyler. Happy Friday.
Yeah, happy Friday to you, kicking off this long Memorial Day weekend and some news making headlines all throughout the state of Michigan, including some not so great news in our local area for public schools. We talked about this in our headline segment earlier on in the week. 27 of Oakland County's 28 school districts seeing enrollment drop between the 2019-2020 school year and this particular school year per count day metrics. The only school district that actually maintained or grew during that time was Clarkston Public Schools. Now, this has a massive impact on our local schools, particularly from state funding. And that's why when you're seeing staggering numbers such as Madison losing almost 20% of its students, Oak Park just under 17%, and Pontiac around 15%, this could have a huge impact on our local schools.
It certainly could. Yeah, I was especially surprised seeing the numbers from Madison and Southfield. But it's actually been kind of a trend that we've been seeing statewide going on for quite some time now. I mean, you've got a couple things going on. Number one, you've got the demographic issues that we've talked about before, which is that you've got fewer children, essentially. And that's something that's impacting education from the beginning to the end. You know, we certainly feel it at the university level at this point, where there are just fewer students out there. And so there's more competition for fewer students out there. But what's more is, especially as a result of the pandemic, people discover that there are other options for educating their kids. You know, there has been growth in the private schools, but the place that we've seen particular growth actually has been in homeschooling and in doing things like, I guess there's an online free public school that you're able to take. There's been huge growth there. And the reason is people are saying, hey, we had our kids home, we were able to educate them, things went well there, so we're going to stick with it. And it's really kind of changed the dynamic quite a bit for a lot of these schools. And as you point out, though, the impact is dramatic because the way that state funding is distributed is it's based upon how many students each school district has on count day. They specify a count day, how many students do you have on that day. And seeing the declines in so many of these districts means that they're going to have less money coming in. And the decline can be quite dramatic. I mean, if you have a decline, I saw one example of about 25 students, that can amount to about $225,000 in less revenue. I mean, you could imagine that could mean a couple of teachers then who have to be laid off. And it can have a huge impact then on the operations of the school district. So I think that we've got these long-term dynamics that are going on in the education space, and it's going to be really interesting to see how they develop over the next few years.
What's been really interesting, too, and this has caught my eye, is given the economic issues we've had, given the job number issues, given issues with inflation, costs for the average family are most definitely on the rise. And so you would think, given that, public school would be the option of choice even after the throes of the pandemic, especially now that we're back into a more normal sense of education as we are in so many other areas of life. But that's not necessarily the case. In fact, we're seeing charter schools continue to have steady or rising enrollment numbers. In fact, the Oakland Press earlier on this week, they had an article, that's one that I was referencing from our website, by Matthew Farr, that he noted many of our Oakland County charter schools have seen enrollment stable over that 3-year period, 2019-2020. To present. One local academy, Lighthouse Connections, has seen theirs actually increase almost 5-fold. And in fact, thinking about the numbers and the costs, a great article today from the Detroit Free Press's Lily Altavina noted that a Detroit charter school, the Detroit Academy of Arts and Sciences, is looking to hire highly qualified, quote unquote, teachers for upwards of $100,000 a year. So surprisingly enough, these charter schools are rising. What is leading to them having such a monumental rise in enrollment, but even beyond that, having the sort of funding to be able to recruit highly talented teachers for great pay and maintain students?
Yeah, the charter schools, it's an interesting business model that they've got essentially. which is that
Yeah.
they're able to get the funding, the per student funding that the public schools would get if they're able to attract the students to their schools. So the way they operate is that they're able to offer, maybe more innovative approaches or maybe more specialized training. In fact, I can tell you from my own experience, my grandson goes to a charter school. It's a Montessori school in Madison Heights. And the reason that he goes there is because the fact that, it's a different learning environment. It suits him particularly well. So he's able to benefit from it. And because of the fact that it's a charter school, they still receive the funding from the state. There's no additional costs then to the parents. So it becomes a very attractive situation. You have to remember, though, we're still talking a relatively small segment of the total school age population, though. Still the vast majority of students are going to the local public schools as they always have. But as we discussed earlier, even a relatively small drop in the student population can have a huge impact then on the bottom line of the local school districts. And that's what we're starting to see in some of these cases.
Yeah, per the Oakland Press's article, again, to reference this great article with a lot of great detail from Matthew Farr at the Oakland Press. He referenced a loss of 25 students, just 25 students. That's maybe one classroom worth of students in an elementary school. Could cost as much as $225,000 in decreases for state funding for school districts. And you think about this, they're not losing typically 25 students. They're losing hundreds of students. That is millions of dollars that are going away from these schools. And Michael, I think about particularly some of the schools that were listed here in Oakland County as those experiencing significant losses. I think about schools like Pontiac and Southfield and Waterford and Oak Park that in some cases have very low income areas or not having a lot of the tax dollars locally going into those schools. And this must be really heavily impacting schools in lower income areas, much more than those in affluent areas. Has to be another big concern statewide.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, I was just reading another article actually where they were talking about the fact, I think it's Grand Blanc, that's offering a $10,000 pay raise to many of its teachers. So we're definitely seeing, again, kind of this division between the rich school districts and the poor school districts, which ends up being kind of this theme. And and as you say, there's been, with schools of choice, there's been kind of this opportunity to kind of drain a lot of the students out of these poor, more struggling public school districts and take them to the wealthier public school districts or into the charter schools. And that really then hurts these struggling public schools because of the fact that they don't have the per student count going on anymore. Now, one thing that's interesting, just kind of global perspective here on it, is I was reading about the state budget negotiations that are going on right now. And one interesting thing jumped out at me, which is that there's been an effort to actually reduce the per pupil funding for some of these online schools, which have really been growing very quickly. These are essentially charter schools where the students do their entire program online. So I guess you could say it's kind of a hybrid between homeschooling and charter schooling, and they get some of the advantages of charter schools without the while also having some of the advantages of homeschooling. And what the legislators are saying is that, hey, these school districts, number one, these charter schools are essentially taking students out of the school districts. And number two, they have lower costs anyway. They don't have to pay for the building. They don't have to pay for the heating. They don't have to pay for all the costs that are associated with actually having a physical school that you're operating. And yet they're getting the same per pupil funding that some of these more traditional schools are receiving. So there's an effort actually in the legislature right now to say, hey, maybe they shouldn't be receiving as much funding. But it goes to show that there's this real dynamic going on right now where how are we going to deal with this change again, where people are moving away from certain public schools, going into other public schools, and in fact, overall public schools are declining, which then ends up being something that hurts the public schools overall.
Yeah, we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic those major disparities that were in place between schools in poorer districts versus those in richer districts. That's what created this necessity to explore better ways to fund our education system here in the state of Michigan. It seems, however, in this current state right now that we're in with public education and enrollment issues, old habits continuing to creep back in. Joining us on the Megacast today, Dr. Michael Greiner, Associate Professor of Management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration, as he does each and every week, joining us for a weekly business and economics segment on the Megacast. You can find all of those on our website, civiccentertv.com/Megacast. Staying on topic of the state budget negotiations, while those in the federal government have a spat back and forth about raising the debt ceiling or defaulting on our loans, those in Lansing are actually negotiating the budget for the next fiscal year. And right now, looking like record-sized budgets both in the House and the Senate. The House proposing $79.5 billion. The Senate just a little bit behind, above that at $80.2 billion. And you mentioned some of the funding being focused on education, one of the so-called winners as of now in these discussions. I'd rather focus on calling them focal points than winners and losers at this moment in time, considering these are just discussions. So what are those focal points right now? Where is Michigan focusing on putting its money and its investments going forward, especially given these record high budget numbers from the House and Senate?
Yeah, well, Michigan really is in the catbird seat right now. And that's because of the fact that we have this huge surplus going on right now. And it has to do with the fact that the economy has bounced back so quickly. So there are, of course, record tax revenues. The federal government also had put quite a bit of money into the state. One thing that's a concern, of course, you mentioned the negotiations over the debt ceiling, is one of the possible actions that the federal government could take to try to resolve this issue is to claw back some of the COVID funding. Well over $1 billion could be at stake for the state of Michigan, where those are federal funds that have come to us, and we're hoping to use in certain ways to fund our own state. So we'll see if what happens there. But a lot of the other funds really aren't in play, and those include things like the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, that's the famously named act that really was a climate bill, very innovative climate bill, but gave a lot of funding to green programs, as they say, programs that are trying to shift us from more of a carbon-based economy over to more of a renewable economy. And the state has gotten huge investments in that. And as a result of that, we're hoping to basically take those funds and send them directly through to the environmental area. And that's something that, frankly, we've probably been underfunding under the years, and it's resulted in some of the things that we are all well aware of. I mean, we've heard about the situations with, for example, the lead pipes, not just in Flint, but in other cities as well. And so that's one of the areas that the state is trying to put funds. They're trying to work more on environmental cleanup and remediation, that type of thing. So certainly the environment, as you say, is going to be a key focal point in this budget, and as well as education, which is going to be a big priority. And of course, I'm glad to see it as a faculty member at a state university myself, that they're making a big priority, not just out of the K through 12 public schools, but also the higher education. And it just makes sense. I mean, this is something that's a priority for the state. They've talked about the 60 by 30 plan that they put together, where the goal is to try to get 60% of Michigan's adults educated with some type of post-secondary education by the time we get to 2030. Right now, we're at about 50%. So it's a big step if we're able to accomplish that. And fortunately, it seems like the state is going to put some funding behind that goal. So that's also something that's been a priority with them. And then finally, the other big thing that we've seen that's a big priority is are the large roads. Where there's been this effort to try to put more funding in the roads. I mean, we all remember when Governor Whitmer was first running for election, and she talked about the fact that we need to fix the damn roads, right? And so she has made some efforts there to try to put some funding in there. But really, the big beneficiaries there have been the larger counties, the major state roads, whereas less of the funds have been directed towards some of the more rural counties, some of the secondary roads there. And that's led to some tensions. But certainly, the road funding has been a priority there. So those are all things that we're seeing kind of being the big focus areas in the budget now, in contrast to some of the other areas that really aren't being prioritized quite as much. One of the areas, as I mentioned, are the rural roads. We're not trying to put so much money, I guess, into the rural roads as we are into some of these more urban, heavily used roads. The way that our funding formula had been in the past for roads is it actually gave some preference to the rural roads. And so as a result of that, there's been an effort in this administration to try to move some of the funding more to some of the more urban, larger counties, like Oakland County, for example, and Macomb County. And so the goal is to try to make some more progress on those roads, which I know all of us listening to this show are going to be very happy to hear about. One of the other losers, though, and something that's kind of near and dear to my heart that I'm a little concerned about, though, is some of the economic development efforts. You know, the governor had made a huge priority out of trying to use incentives to bring new investments to the state. And she's actually been quite successful in that regard. But the concern is, I guess, that there's this whole movement among certain legislators that, hey, maybe we don't want to offer so many of these incentives to try to get new investments. And I guess there's a little bit of a tension going on there where there might be some negotiations over how much we're actually going to be willing to put into some of these investments. And, you know, I think it's important to note from a political standpoint kind of how this whole situation has developed, because this is the first time that we've had unified control of state government by the Democrats in 40 years. So the Democrats really, part of what you're seeing here is they're kind of excited about the opportunity that they have to really put their mark on the policies. So that's where you're seeing the shift in some of these priorities. But by the same token, the Republicans can't be totally ignored, because the fact that for the budget to go into effect on time, it needs to pass the Senate by a 2/3 vote. And to do that, you're going to need some Republican votes. So you need to essentially be able to negotiate with Republicans on that. And one thing that Republicans, for example, had said is a priority for them are some of these economic development issues. So there might have to be some negotiation there. But it's going to be interesting to see the way things go forward. You know, certainly, I know that the state is almost giddy with the kind of money that they're dealing with. We're looking at probably around an $80 billion budget, which will be a historic budget for the state of Michigan. And, you know, if they're able to make progress in some of these areas, I think that it would certainly be a great investment for the long term.
Yeah, certainly things we're going to continue to see be big in the news on the business and economic side in the state of Michigan. Where are they investing this money, especially into the damn roads? Because of the COVID funding that has come in over the last few years, these projects really being kicked into high gear before that funding runs out. That's been an emphasis statewide. Dr. Greiner, thank you as always for joining us. Appreciate your time.
It's great to be here. Have a happy Memorial Day weekend.